Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Chess Mathsters. Today, we're going to be reviewing a bunch of book openings or basic openings that you should know. We're going to go over 5 today, but we may do more in future videos, so stay tuned for that. Keep in mind, we're not going to go into depth on all of these openings. We're just going to kind of hit the surface, look at the first couple moves of what we're going to do. In other videos, we'll go more in depth and look at more of the moves. So first, let's start with the King's Pawn opening.
The first one we're going to be looking at is the King's Pawn opening. And there are many variations after the King's Pawn opening. But the King's Pawn opening is basically e4 and e5. And this is probably an opening you've seen hundreds of times if you play chess. This opening is probably one of the most common openings in chess ever. So there are many different ways that you can counter this, or different variations. So there's a King's Knight variation, where you go like this, Knight f3, and Knight c6. And this usually sometimes leads into the Italian game. And we have that in another video, so please look at that. Another way that this can play out is by doing f4. And this is known as the King's Gambit. And this is a very aggressive and interesting gambit, and we'll look at this in a future video. Let's move on to our next position.
Okay, the next opening we are going to cover is the French defense. The French defense, like a bunch of other openings that you will see, starts off with e4 played by white. But instead of e5, black plays e6. So not moving the pawn as far as you would in the King's Pawn, which we reviewed before. Now, this is normally followed up by d4 on white's end, and then d5. Now, there are 2 ways this can play out, actually 3, but most of the time it falls into one of these 2 categories. Either the pawn takes, the pawn pushes, or the pawn just stays there and does nothing. Most of the time, people either take or push, and I think pushing is even more common. And I personally like to play push because it makes for a more aggressive opening. When you take, the game gets a little bland, in my opinion, but you can play however you want. So that's it for the French defense. I know we're going through these quickly, so try to keep up. Next, we're going to take a look at the Sicilian, which is quite different.
So the next one we're going to be looking at is the Sicilian, which is e4 and c5. And this is very interesting. As you can see, a center pawn was pushed for white, but a wing pawn was pushed for black. We studied this opening in more detail in another video, so stay tuned for that. So after this is Knight f3 and d6. And then we have d4, c takes d4, and knight takes d4. This is known as the Sicilian Defense open variation, and it's very interesting. Even though white looks more developed with this white pawn and this white knight, with only a black pawn barely developed, look at this. As you see here, instead of trading off a center pawn for a center pawn, we actually black traded off a wing pawn for a center pawn. And that sometimes is said more valuable for black. So this can sometimes be a better position for black. The Sicilian defense is a super advanced variation, I'm going to tell you that. And there's so many ways that you can counter or play it out. And another one is the accelerated dragon, and that's very complicated and very aggressive. But we'll look at that in another video, and you can also look at our Open Sicilian video that we have right now. Okay, so the next one we're going to be looking at is d4, d5, c4, the Queen's Gambit.
Okay, so after that complicated opening, the Sicilian, we'll move on to something a little bit simpler, called the Queen's Gambit. You may have noticed, as the King's Gambit or in the Queen's Gambit, they end with Gambit, which means to sacrifice a little bit of material to hopefully get something in the end. We won't talk about exactly a bunch of what gambits can do to the player, but we'll we'll talk about that in a separate video. For now, let's get into it. The Queen's Gambit starts with d4. This is actually the first opening that we've done so far that does not start with advancing the king's pawn. This is responded to with d5, kind of like the king's pawn opening, but on the queen side. Next, c4. Remember, we talked about this, sacrificing a little bit of material to get something big in the end. Now, we won't say exactly what happens, but either you get some pretty good development, or there's actually a trap that black has to be careful about. We'll go over that in another video, so be sure to check that out when that comes. So, the accepted variation is when black takes the pawn. Now, it is a bit risky because remember, if you take the material, you might actually be taking the risk for the trap. Now, this is all as far as we're going to go today, but we'll talk about what happens and how white might be able to trap black if black's not careful. But for now, let's head into the final opening. This is going to be called the King's Indian Defense. This is our final opening that we're going to go over today. This is called the King's Indian Defense. Once again, like the last opening, the Queen's Gambit, it starts with d4. However, this is not met by d5. This is met by something you might think is a bit odd. Normally, you think of advancing pawns as your first move, but this doesn't actually advance a pawn as the first move. Black actually plays knight f6, and this is actually considered widely the best response to this. So, normally, white plays c4. You might have noticed white has played the same exact first two moves as they did in the Queen's Gambit, and black plays g6. Now, it might not seem all that great. He's not really advancing the center, but black is hoping to kind of like stay back a little bit and strike in the center later. You might also notice that black moved that pawn, maybe because he wants to play bishop g6. And that looks like a really nice diagonal for that bishop. Also, black's center pawns are still pretty free. He doesn't have to move them now, but he can always move them later. So there isn't really a rush. He just wants to make sure he can still get back into the center as soon as he is ready. That's our final opening. Now let's take a look back at all of the openings we've done so far.
Thanks for watching. Today, we looked at 5 different openings that are very common that can help you win games or be prepared to play them. We looked at e4, e5, the king's pawn opening, e4, e6, the French defense, e4, c5, the Sicilian, d4, d5, and then c4, the Queen's Gambit, and finally d4, knight f6, c4, and g6, which is the King's Indian Defense. Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll always be notified when we release new videos. We hope to do math and puzzles soon, so stay tuned for that. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching.